Today, we'll delve into my favorite topic, AI and startups, with Bryan Hale, Managing Director of the AI Incubator in Seattle. Hello, Bryan.
Hey, Don, how are you?
Today's an interesting day to be recording, but we'll get on with the episode.
Fair enough.
Yeah, a
Well,
little
thanks,
bit about
Brian.
yourself.
Thanks for having me on.
Uh, so, Brian H., maybe just start out and give us an exposition on what you're doing and how you're helping startups get going on
Will
AI.
do. So I'm on the incubator team at the Allen Institute for AI, or AI2, as we refer to it. And AI2 itself, as an institute, is an independent AI research institute based in Seattle, founded by Paul Allen and Oren Etzioni about 5 years ago. We now have 150 plus PhDs and researchers and engineers, all pushing the boundaries of fundamental AI research for the common good. And the incubator, which I help run, is a sort of commercial offshoot of the institute, and we help launch AI first startups.
It, maybe share with us a little bit with Paul Allen's vision in terms of how he's pretty good at crossing the boundaries between public interest and commercialization.
Sure, I can't speak for Paul, and I didn't know him, and I joined AI2 unfortunately after he had passed. But I can tell you a little bit about sort of what I understand his founding vision of AI2 to be, which I think is sort of emblematic of how he viewed sort of general endeavors like this. When Paul co-founded AI2 with Oren Etzioni, who's our CEO today, he made an observation in the AI labor market that I think is now sort of a little bit more widely shared, which was essentially that if you looked at where a lot of the sort of PhD and PhD level researchers were working, they tended to either be in academic settings where they had a lot of freedom but not a lot of resources, or they tended to be at large enterprises, typically large internet and large technology companies, where they had a lot of resources but not necessarily a lot of freedom to work on things that mattered to them. And AI2 jumps somewhere in the middle of that and gives folks resources to go pursue meaningful problems outside of narrower commercial interests. And Paul was in a position where he had the resources to make something like that happen. And he looked out into the future and saw that AI was going to potentially have a really big impact on society over the next several decades, and felt that it was important to have a collection of talent and resources with that mission at that time. And so far, so good.
And from the problem space, and this is not just now, not just at your current gig, but also in the past. Our practitioners of AI and machine learning, we're always, looking for these new problems that are hard enough to solve, that need ML, but not so hard they're impossible. Have you ran into that where there's some problems that are just too hard to be solved, or just too simple by that matter?
We tend to think that way, absolutely. I think for any early stage effort, whether it's a research effort or a theorized problem to go out and solve as a researcher, or whether it's a new company to go be created by an entrepreneur, timing matters. And what we will often do in our context at the AIT Incubator when we're working with entrepreneurs is we will map the problems that they want to solve to whatever we sort of collectively view would be the right, if there is, solution from the AI world, an AI or machine learning approach, and to think through, is this something that is now possible? Or even better, is this something that will soon be possible? We most commonly see that today, I think, in the world of natural language processing, although there's many other areas that are sort of crossing these thresholds in AI, where is a model that can be built when properly trained on data now just good enough? Has it moved from not quite good enough to good enough to actually perform the task at hand? And that sort of intersection, that moment in time, and maybe, like I said, just before that moment in time is probably the best time to go out and start the company and pursue that problem in earnest.
And probably a good time to talk about the talent funnel for your incubator in a very rich one in Seattle.
Absolutely. So on that last point, we're homers. We're based in Seattle. We're big believers in Seattle, and we think that Seattle is a market that is really poised to take off because of the collection of talent that's around here. At the incubator, specifically at AI2, we tend to recruit talent from a number of different places of a number of different profiles. And our whole thesis in general is that for an AI first company to be successful, it helps to have some combination of AI talent, folks who can provide edge with how a model is designed and trained. They need to have industry expertise and someone who can help go to market. And need somebody who can go build products. Um, Seattle, it turns out, is a pretty good town for that. There's a lot of long-standing industries, lots of successful entrepreneurs and company builders, and lots of AI and lots of cloud talent. The thing is about Seattle, or really any secondary market beyond the Bay Area, those people won't naturally collide with each other. If you're a great entrepreneur and you've started several companies and you know how to scale up organizations and you have good nose for problems, you may not actually know the AI talent and vice versa.
And I don't know. It almost sounds like unicorn hunting sometimes, but in Seattle, I'm not surprised if you find people with all those aspects because the talent pool is so rich. In the talent pool that you have, what sort of diversity helps? I mean, I hear that diversity helps, and also, what sort of culture does your organization? Is that a part of it? Do you try to harvest culture, or that I know these are separate startups sometimes, but how do you do that?
So the surveys will tell you, and most people's own personal experiences will tell you that the largest source of sort of early failure for a startup is co-founder conflict, right? And this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and frankly, we need to be very good at for our model to work. Because as I was describing earlier, you're basically taking people who may not have ever met each other before starting to work together on a new company. And how do you get those teams to a place where they're actually comprised of the right people and they can work cohesively, not just for a few months as they're building out a prototype, but really 5, 10 years down the road? And our somewhat maybe unexpected belief on this, which I think has borne out in practice pretty well, is that if you actually don't know each other very well, it's sometimes easier to assess fit. I've seen, and you folks may have seen as well, in a lot of sort of so-called organic startups, the way the founders come together is somewhat arbitrary, and it has this a modest amount of understanding between each other, just enough so that you don't ask hard questions. So a company that was started with co-founders who happened to have been in a college class together, or happened to work on a project together at a large company, or their spouses were in book club together. I've seen that one. They may know each other just well enough not to actually ask really hard, direct questions about fit. But somewhat counterintuitively, if you're meeting for the first time, it's very easy to ask questions like, "Hey, what kind of company do you want to build? What are you really good at? What are the things that annoy you?" And start working together in an environment that is relatively low risk and low cost, and assess fit that way. We've had pretty good success with that so far.
Brian H., I think you just explained Brian Ray and my failures trying to launch a startup.
Well, the
Um,
love is still there, Don.
well, I think Ben Horowitz also brought up that not having enough tension amongst founders is a big problem, and that's probably straight to the point of Brian Ray and me as
Yeah,
founders.
well, hey, yeah, we get along too fabulously, and our startup was never really took off. But I guess that's part of it. But I can. Is there any times that you've ever told someone that their ideas, far fetched? I mean, if you just told them like, this isn't doesn't either doesn't make sense, or it's too soon, or anything like that.
um, you don't like to ever say that, right? Because startups are fueled by ambition, and startups are inherently low likelihood events of success. Certainly, the best ones are. So um, ultimately, I think you do have to occasionally say that, right? And one of the things that we do, given our focus and our expertise from the AI world, is try to very early on assess sort of technical validation. And is this now possible? one of the things that we do see from time to time is particularly on in the founding CEO profile, or folks that don't come from the AI world, like myself, frankly, not too long ago, is you tend to imbue AI with sort of magical capabilities in your mind, and you assume that anything is possible. Um, where in reality, I think today, AI is still in sort of narrow use cases and still narrow capabilities. And so oftentimes there's some grounding conversations we have pretty early on with folks that want to go tackle ambitious, sort of problem spaces, but they're sort of giving too much credit and imbuing AI with too many capabilities that may not yet exist. So we have to have that conversation every so often, but you never want to dial back the level of ambition. I think it's always dangerous to do that.
Well, maybe delve into a case that's a huge win for AI too is Xnor and their recent acquisition by Apple. Those founders seem like they could really benefit from your help, for example, since just with the background where they came from.
Sure, would love to chat through this one. And this is another one that I can't claim too much personal involvement. Xnor was one of the very first companies to spin out of AI2. It was a handful of founders, Ali and Mohammed in particular, who were splitting time between being researchers at AI2 and professors at the University of Washington, and also helped create Xnor as a new startup, which is effectively the embodiment of our thesis, right? Which is that really great startups can exist at the intersection of research and entrepreneurship. Um, the innovation that they built, not to go too far into the details, was really around computer vision and how to run computer vision models out on the edge in a very resource efficient way. So there was a somewhat well-known demo they did of a Raspberry Pi Zero that was solar powered, operating in a disconnected fashion, doing real-time object detection. So driving through the city streets of San Francisco and with a camera attached, being able to pick up street signs and cars and pedestrians and bicycles and newspaper stands in real time while driving. And this was a case of a fundamental technology breakthrough that was had a whole bunch of obvious commercial applications, but the initial one may not have been inherently obvious. This was a company that was incubated at AI2 and spun out of AI2. 3 years later, after some commercial success and a lot of success in building a wonderful team, it raised about $15 million and was recently acquired by Apple. One of the 6 or so companies that have spun out of AI2, and certainly the biggest realized success so far. One we're very excited about.
And you expect that for every single one from now on, correct?
that is the bar. I think the whole reason that we exist, again, is because the mission of the incubator has a lot of overlap with the mission of AI2 overall, which is we want impact. And a great way to realize that is with companies that can go on to be successful, not only have an impact on the world, but build large employee bases with great culture, long-standing businesses with successful customers, and then for me personally, companies that can spawn others over time, right? I think if you have a startup that achieves a certain level of scale and influence, it's going to have an impact for decades because you can encourage other team members to go on and start new companies. That's what gets us all excited. 7 years from now, I want to be able to tell some, I knew them when stories. I knew that founder when they didn't quite have the idea dialed in, and now they're, ringing the bell at NASDAQ.
Don and I have a couple of those too. I would appreciate those. So I always ask this. Can I ask the precautionary question, Don? Or is it fair?
Well, I mean, it's your show.
It's our show. So, and we touched on this a little bit before we hit record too, and you don't have to bring up that specific example, but with science and AI and machine learning, is there any precautionary story, or do you have any fears of it? Is there any risk in it going wrong?
We use the phrase, and you've probably heard this phrase, sort of payoff curve, in a lot of cases when we're working through kind of market and use case selection with entrepreneurs. and there's certain areas of the market where the payoff curve is friendly to a new AI startup, and there's certain markets where you need to be a little more careful. And when I say payoff curve, I'm essentially meaning what is the cost of something going wrong, and what is the benefit of something going right. And the healthcare world and certainly the biomedical world is one where the things can go horribly wrong if you don't have a lot of the proper safeguards in place. And so, whenever you have sort of a payoff curve with a significant downside, and when there's human life involved or the consequences of misdiagnosis involved, you just need to be incredibly thoughtful about um, how you frame predictions. Right? These are all probabilistic scenarios, and so, how do you frame those predictions, and what kinds of promises do you make around those predictions? And then, how do you get the human in the loop, right? So, one obvious example that many people are probably familiar with is all of these computer vision and imaging use cases from the medical world, right? Helping radiologists spot tumors on scans, right? And what you'll oftentimes see successfully is, bounding boxes around where those tumors are perceived to be by the computer vision model, with some assessment of the probability that it thinks and the likelihood that it thinks that those actually are tumors. And then how do you artfully keep that human in the loop and allow them to bring their expertise to bear to arrive at the right solution? Um, that world, generally speaking, is not ready for level 5 automation. If you were to borrow the framework from the autonomous car industry.
And when you touch on healthcare, we're really touching on a lot of sort of cultural boundary issues between the traditional craft of healthcare and software. I'd imagine those are kind of the intersections where you can really lend a lot of help to for nascent entrepreneurs.
Sorry, Don. Do you mind kind of unpacking that a little bit?
Well, from my perceptions, what I've seen with like my Python group in the past, for example, um, we have quite a few folks who are working at healthcare orgs like Fred Hutch or something like that, where they're really introducing some new concepts to the mainline researchers, for example, and a lot of the folks in healthcare just aren't aware of the full gamut of possibilities with just fairly prosaic software, let alone AI, for example. And just seems for me that somebody coming from a traditional healthcare background, for example, with a premise and some grounding in the software, um, AI2 and like organizations could really give them a boost.
Oh,
Some
okay. Yeah. So I completely see that phenomenon. I see that opportunity in the market, really. I think one of the sort of scenarios or contexts in which I'm most excited about my day job is when we have occasion to pull people quite literally into a room from those various backgrounds and see and sort of lightly guide a very lively discussion around where are there some interesting kind of problem and solution pairings, right? So we'll do brainstorm sessions every so often, typically on some combination of a enabling technology and a problem space. And as I was sort of alluding to earlier, oftentimes these people won't necessarily navigate to each other. The fundamental AI researchers who know exactly what's happening on the cutting edge of natural language processing probably aren't hanging out with the general counsels and the partners at law firms that have mountains of documents that they need to be able to categorize and understand that no human could ever actually pore over, right? But when you get those people in the same room and sort of map what is an enabling technology that is maybe now just good enough to solve a problem that has been long standing in a particular industry, that's where amazing startups are created. And it's also just an intellectually very, very interesting conversation to be a fly on the wall for. That's the most fun thing that I do as part of my role at AI2.
And how does the implementation and, for instance, the cloud providers and the technology interplay in that relationship too? I mean, don't you need all three?
That's a great point. The line item for any AI first startup, and this goes for AI too as well, one of the biggest line items, unfortunately, on the operating statement is going to be the cost of your cloud bill. Um, and you need to be very mindful about sort of how you wield it, but sort of bringing in compute in the right form at the right time is incredibly important. And it turns out most of the compute in the world is starting to consolidate around a handful of companies. Luckily, two of those are our neighbors here in Seattle. Hugely important, absolutely important.
Well, even Google, in some sense, is a neighbor since their cloud HQ is just across the lake from you.
That's true. We're our office in North Lake. If you go to up to our rooftop, and I encourage you folks to come over, particularly in the summer when there's seaplanes buzzing overhead. It's the best 4 days of the year. We can look across the lake and see Amazonia across Lake Union. Around the bend in Fremont is where Google still has a number of employees. They're of course in South Lake Union as well. And then if you sort of go around the bend and you navigate underneath the Montlake Bridge and head out to the lake, you got Microsoft right there on the other side of Lake Washington. Some meaningful portion of the world's compute. Certainly, the lines of code that help um, instantiate and manage the world's compute live in Seattle.
Yeah, and you're right in the heat of it. And I always see there's pros and cons with that. Don and I talk about this and the cultural impact of having, someone who could jump ship so easily to something that's not a startup or to a different startup or just thrashing about aimlessly in the dark on occasion. Are you seeing any of that in Seattle yet? Like what used to happen in the Valley?
Oh, the sort of liquidity in the labor market where I might go somewhere for a tour of duty that's 2 years, and if it doesn't work out, kind of hop to the next best opportunity.
Exactly.
So it's a new phenomenon in Seattle. It's something that's maybe in the last 10 or 15 years we've started to see a lot more of. Historically, this was a company town as far as the technology industry was concerned, right? People would move here from Microsoft, and when they moved here, they more or less were making a 10, 15-year commitment to Microsoft, because if that gig didn't work out, there wasn't many other places in town where they could ply their trade. You fast forward to today, and at least if you're an engineer in this town, you've of course got Microsoft and now Amazon and 150 or so significant engineering offices, largely from Bay Area companies. Everybody's up here now, as well as a growing startup ecosystem. We have that labor market liquidity, not quite to the level of the Bay Area, but what that means and what I get excited about and a lot of others get excited about for the startup ecosystem is yes, you may move here for Microsoft or Amazon. And if and when you get enticed by the startup world, you're the level of risk, if you look at it in a certain way, is much lower, right? Because if that startup doesn't work out, you'll have to go out and get another job, but you're going to have a lot of suitors, right? It will not take long to either go back to Microsoft or Amazon or pick any one of these other folks to go to. There was a remark made, I think, by Oren, our CEO, a little while back when he was relaying the story of someone who'd had a startup that didn't pan out, and that person said, "Oh, after my startup failed and I had to go out and find a new job, that was like the worst 15 minutes of my life." And it's just about true, right? And in our role at AI too, we sort of try to, from a recruiting perspective, kind of bird dog what's happening out in the market and see if there's pockets and groups of people who might be out on the market looking for new things. And if you're not quick, they're gone. It's a highly, highly liquid labor market right now, and that's a great thing for startups.
And for folks who are at one of the big companies and they take a risk at a startup, what I perceive is they'll get a better understanding of product because I see a lot of high performing engineers who just really don't have any clue on product. And they really have an opportunity at that point, I think, to go back to one of the big companies and take a more senior role where they're possibly into the seven figures, right, for compensation.
Yeah, there's this in our world. The other thing I would add to that is of course sort of the AI competency. The folks who are worth their weight in gold or close to it, quite literally, is somebody who can build a product and sort of have a sense for what the right thing might be to build based on the signal they're getting from the market and customers and maybe their innate sense, but also somebody who can apply some AI along the way. And it's sort of that confluence of those three factors that you need to have on a team. What we typically find when we're talking to co-founders is it's not uncommon, I think, increasingly to have somebody who's got sort of two out of those three things. Very rarely do you find three. But anybody out there that thinks they live at the intersection of those capabilities, right? Can you build a little product? Do you have a sense of the right thing to build? And can you sort of apply AI and sort of innovate a little bit on the AI piece? We want to talk to you. It's Bryan H at allenai.org. Send me emails. That's our sweet spot. That's the fuel, or certainly one of the big fuels for great companies.
Oh, thank you, Bryan.
I'm happy to.
Yeah, thank you, Bryan, for being on. This is fantastic and great content, and it sounds like you're right in the heat of it. So thank you for adding content to our podcast, and our listeners appreciate it too.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.